how's the practice been coming?
Um,
Some you're having a bit of trouble with extensions with no root.
yeah, I think I found them a bit easier now that I can think of especially with since there are only three notes, which notes to actually substitute out. Like, obviously, with that one, I think it was really easy to find those little like shortcuts, the where you go down from the first to get the major seventh, and the shortcuts make it a lot easier. And I haven't been practicing too much because there was the break last week. I sort of just took a break from that, and I was focusing. We still had assessments and stuff, so I was going through that. And an interesting thing we were doing a composition, and I was finding all these things that were sort of relating to what we were doing. Like, a lot of the chords, they're basically other chords, because when we were doing extensions, like a G7 is just a B diminished with an added note, and like a lot of things were sort of making a lot more sense, and sort of
Yeah, actually, with that particular one, that's a good. You're a teacher and you're going to hand out blues tips. A G7 is a B minor 7 flat 5. Actually, more accurately, a G9 is a B minor 7 flat 5.
yeah.
And I use that sub all the time because it just sounds cool. Like, instead of yeah. Or the one where you put the seventh in the bass. So on G, it'd be this one. That's a really cool kind of 50 sounding chord. Which is like, it's like if you imagine G6 based off a C shape. His you make a G6, then you put the root down to the 7. Or you can think of it as like an E minor with E sharpened.
Yeah.
But it's a killer one. Like, whenever you need that kind of uptown jazz feel, that's what it's pretty cool to go through. Okay, so some of it has been working, which is good. What I was planning to do with today, if you have a look at the sheet says chord progressions you need to know and recognize. And it's a whole bunch of like common chord progressions that I still hear all the time in all kinds of different music. Could be jazz, could be classical, could be a whole bunch of that kind of like, I suppose modern pop, but it's like the pop stuff that kind of gets influenced by other things,
Yeah.
So not Ariana Grande. Although I'm sure her writers like steal the crap out of these lines too.
Sorry, my cat was just on my desk. She was walking around.
Yeah, of course, cat coming in. Usually in my afternoon lessons, one of my cats comes by and it's just like, well, you're not doing anything, and just like starts like honking at me.
Yeah, I think when she gets annoyed, she jumps up on the desk and tries to get attention from people. But yeah, she's fine.
The same cat of ours gets really annoyed when we're because she'll go into the office and the laptop will be folded up, and normally she likes to curl up on the laptop like a little heat mat.
Yeah.
And it's like the laptop will be up, and she'll be like, "Well, I can't get in here."
Yeah, well, I don't know if you can see her down there. She's sitting on a cardboard rectangle down there under the chair.
Yeah. The little homeless mats they get.
Yeah.
We keep a bunch of boxes around for them.
Yeah, she's got one right up there on top of the chest of drawers. That's her main sitting area.
Right.
She likes to be up high.
Yeah. Cats are fun. We have one that like climbs on top of everything, and it's like when we first got her, the person we got her off the foster care was like, she's gonna climb everything. And we're like, well, there's not really that much to climb in our place, but like that's fine. And it's like places you didn't think a cat could get to. You just come in, like, holy crap! How did you get up to the top shelf in the kitchen? Like,
yeah,
there's no way of climbing. Okay. So to illustrate a kind of a basic point, and something that's nice to add to your repertoire. Have we talked about the cycle fifth exercise? I think we have.
Yeah.
How much have you been doing it?
I found it a lot easier to go through it now than obviously when I first started it. Haven't been doing it obviously too much in the last sort of week, but I think I can still sort of go through it.
Somebody is texting me like, "Are we on today?" It's like, check your emails.
Oh. Oh, sorry. Oh, that's all right.
So you're doing it exclusively on those triad pairs and the DGBs.
Yeah.
Because like I think the next step for you would be to open that up a little bit, because you're like caged familiar. So like one way that I would look at it is to say if you're instead of coming to there, come down to the root. Yeah, and like experiment with changing onto the bass and the treble strings, like the top strings and the low two. Because it really helps kind of cement a lot of knowledge in. Now, that's an interesting exercise. It's always changing chords, but I think you can do the same thing with pretty much any chord progression. And it's a very, very, very valuable thing for you to do as a player, which is kind of what we're going to take a look at with some of these chord progressions. So, like, that's effectively a 1 to 5 change. It's cycling the fifths, right? Even though what I just played was fourths, but pretend I started in the second chord and do second fifth. So what we could do instead of this kind of thing is say we could go a chord progression, but we could just look at say 1 to 5, 1 to 4, right? And play like if we're going to do just the DGB strings, play like a 4-note game. So you play 4 notes, and you're not allowed to double up in a position. So. Right, so moving around the neck, just thinking about 2 different chords. Now, I'm saying 4 because that's a nice, easy, 4 beats in a bar kind of exercise.
Yeah.
But you can usually do more, and I usually do more, and I also normally do more than just 2 chords. I did start with just trying to have a go at 2 chords because I used to find the labor in brain really, really taxing. I think the real trick is to not think about the chord you're on. Like if you're playing 4 notes of C, way back here you're thinking, I'm going to G. If you don't, and you wait till that change point, a bit like, I'm sure eventually it will become smooth enough, just like chords did. Like I don't know if you remember, or I mean, you teach people. So like when people learning chords, it's like you don't need to think about the chord that your fingers are on.
Yeah.
And if you do, you won't be making the change in time. So you're thinking it's kind of like ahead kind of thing. So just to get started, let's have a look at doing. You want to do 1 to 5 or 1 to 4?
We can do 1 to 5.
1 to 5. In key C. Okay, so you started on the DGB pairs. I've run out of notes here, so I'm going to go somewhere else. All right, and now I'm thinking G. So where the improvisation of this whole thing comes in is I could come up to G. or I could come down.
Yeah.
All right. And if you notice yourself constantly using similar pairs, that's one of those things where you're like, okay, well, I'm not gonna let myself go whichever direction I'm normally going. I always go down, so I'm not gonna let myself go down. I'm gonna go up to find the next note of this arpeggio. Have a crack. So, just move my little video
Move this over. And or would you go from that D? Would you go back to another G? G, B, D. Would you go to another G?
It doesn't really matter. Like, as long as it's a chord tone from the next chord, right? Oh, sorry, we're still on the G chord. I thought you'd come down like you. Now, one problem with being on G at the change, right, is we can't sit here. We've really got to make sure that we shift that outside. Don't pedal, you know.
Yeah.
And if you end up, say, you're on a C chord and you naturally point towards a G, sometimes that can sound a little weak. You know, like if you're, you know, like it can sound cool. There's a lot of classical melodies that do that, where they pedal this note in between a chord. If you're going to do that, you kind of need to make it a feature. Even at the beginning, I wouldn't necessarily consider too much with any of that. The first thing you want to do is get used to seeing C and G everywhere.
Yeah.
Because that's what you're going to tie into when you're playing, right? Like, if you put a 7 in this, like flat 7 on both of the chords, you turn this into a blues. So, like, stylistic things are going to get layered on top of that. You know, like if I was going to do this as a blues, C7 to G7, then I'd be thinking like pentatonics overlaid. I'd be thinking of flat 7s, and any of that that's splitting. Your major, minor, third. And you can do the exercise. It's kind of like stylistically, because you know I'm going to go C7 to G7 everywhere around the neck too. Like, you know, the more you can kind of make the chords cool, the better. One I really liked doing for quite a while, actually, which is kind of a combination of this and the next dot point on the sheet, is 1 to 4 minor, like E minor here, sorry, E major. To an A minor. That chromatic shifted. I thought it was really pretty. So I spent quite a lot of time sitting and doing that all over the neck in many different ways. And obviously you want to try expanding the chord progressions out as that starts feeling easier. Like when I was looking at something, another simple progression this week, which is like E minor, A minor, G, and then D major. And just trying to cover as much ground on the neck as possible as I'm doing. Especially because you'll hit a certain point where probably doing them all really, you know, it's really easy to do them all close voiced and repetitive and all inside of a little box here. So, you know, you might be the inverse. You might actually see it broader than that. But I would assume most people would find it easy at a certain point to get it all done in one little position. And then it's about how wide can I make those ideas out? Not necessarily because, you know, I'm going to make all my melodies have that, but because I want that in my trick bag. Like I want to be able to cover a great deal of the neck. One of the exercises I was doing with that was like playing arpeggios from the bass string as far as you can get them on each of those chords. You know? Doing that kind of thing where you're doing really big, long, or pedaling a bass note.
Yeah.
Holding B the whole time. Cool. Okay, so experimenting around with 1 to 5, 1 to 4. One of the next things that I think is really useful to get your head around is 4 to 4 minor. we already took a look at that in some ways in the Nearness of You. You know, it's just such a commonly used pop progression. A lot of people think of it as like the heartbreak progression. Paul McCartney was really obsessed with it. He creates this nice voice leading that we have the A from the F chord to the C to an A flat to the G from the C. So you get this kind of chromatic voice. And again, it's almost always about how we create these tensions and resolutions.
Yeah.
So that quite often gets paired with the thing we've got underneath it, the major line or minor line cliche. Well, one of the major line cliche I actually didn't write down there, which would be that if we take like the start of a blues, you might say do C major, C major 7, C7, F, F minor, C. And the idea there is, we've got C, major 7, dominant 7, acting as let's say tritone, secondary dominant for F, right? Then we go to F. Get this complete chromatic line feeding off and down into C again before we then tack on some end bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you know that progression? It's fun to play around with.
Sort of not really, but and so when you say 1 sharp 5, is that you're not adding adding
it. So
okay.
The first one is the major cliche. The major cliche. I think musicals think something like Chicago. Like we do this on G. It's like someone's talking. Yeah. It's the riffing bit before the song starts.
Yeah.
It's not a bad way of filling time. That one does feel somewhat dated these days, but like sometimes we're after that kind of flavor. Like, that whole 50s revival sound was really popular. Like further down on the page, there's one that I've called what's it called? Instead of doing like 1 6 2 5, right? You replace the 6 with a tritone sub of A7. So which was really, really common in that kind of like 50s-ish progression, and it's become kind of popular again. Like I think I heard a Doja Cat song that was using that recently. And I'm sure that Lana Del Rey has been using that. It's one of these quotes of nostalgia that you put inside something and then probably sing about drugs over top of it to make it cliche between. Not a cliche. Juxtaposition between the two ideas. Okay, so let's take a look at the minor line cliche because there's some fun exercises to do in there. So exactly the same idea in the sense. The falling line. The raising line one is James Bond.
Yeah.
Half asleep today. Okay, so the minor line cliche as a falling line. It's that chromatic line, C down to the 4 minor.
Yeah.
Okay. So C minor major 7, C minor 7, and C minor 6. Now, technically, that's the voice thing. You probably want to drop most of it out, like take the pinky out of it, do it as a kind of a shell voicing. Yeah, it's not the worst, and like if you do all your inversions, like your inversion plates and things, you'll get much weirder shapes than this. And by that I mean more string inversions. So like if you do your jazz inversions, we do like C major 7 and the next C major 7 and the next C major 7. Those ones, they're worth a cool look. First inversion ones sound really cool. Like that sounds like a cool major 7. Okay. And then F minor. Usually we then, because it's jazz, as jazz I did, we might end up with a 2/5. Now, this chord progression is quite often used in jazz standards where essentially there are blues, there are minor blues. And if you think of a minor blues, you've just got this ages of C minor up front. And the blues guys might have dealt with that by throwing in a quick change to the 4. Where you do like. But another way of kind of creating interest is to put that chromatic line through it, so that way you're always kind of insinuating where you're going. You're creating this tension towards the 4 chord.
Yeah.
So a cool thing to do with that as an improvisational exercise, right, is if we're following the rules of everything else we've talked about, you'd just be doing C minor for ages, and then F minor. But it's a much more fun idea to take the chromatic line as gospel, right? That's going to give you your chord changes. It's kind of almost all you need. And a 2/5 probably. So have a crack at you take that line, and you can do something as simple as overlaying, say, C minor pentatonic. Yeah, I think including your blue note is probably a cool idea. And you play that, you've got to play the chromatic line on the beat that it would be announced on.
Yeah.
But anything else you put in between that is fill, right?
Yeah.
In different octaves and in different places on the neck, obviously. Yeah, I mean, if you want to think about it modally, think about it as Phrygian, like a G Phrygian.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah. After that F minor, think D minor 7 flat 5, so it's the 2 chord, and then I like G altered, right? But essentially G7. All right, that's almost always what's going to happen at the end of that, in terms of most jazz standards, and like a hell of a lot of songs. Does Michelle do that? Like Michelle.
even in the intro to Michelle / chorus of Michelle, you get off the 4 chord, right? We're doing a minor line cliche of the 4. And there's your dominant Michelle, which goes into F major at that point. So this points out a cool thing to do with, chord progressions, and that's if there's a distinctive line, and you can use that line as a framework to kind of tie you in with notes.
Yeah.
If there's not a distinctive line, you might find one when you play around with your extensions, right? So like if we took a 2-5-1, right, so to me, I've added in 9 on the 2, flat 9 on the 5, down to 1. So if I think of it as kind of guide ideas, guide tones for what I'm going to play. Right, like
Yeah.
it starts becoming some pretty things. Just because I'm hitting very distinctive notes that sound cool, right? And that's really what is meant by like targeting chord tones. I think more so ever than knowing where your root third and fifth is. That's obviously important, and like one of the reasons why root third and fifth is so important is that they're the ones you kind of play around. If you got a G minor, you might have a melody that you see, I'm just surrounding the notes of G minor with the other tones, diatonic tones from the scale there.
Yeah.
Because I'm kind of floating around the chord tone, things are still feeling like G, and it's still feeling like I'm rooted somewhere, which is the major problem with people who jump straight to modes, like I did. I'd learned kind of learned some pentatonic stuff, and I could play a lot of solos. And I had this lesson with a good friend of the family who's a jazz player, and he's like, okay, well, next step would be modes. So I learned a whole bunch of modes, and then for years tried to figure out, I was like 14 or something, but for years tried to figure out like how do you make these things work? And I would find that I could make them work in certain styles, like in flamenco, it was that kind of like Spanishy feel. It felt really easy to kind of make them work, and it's kind of because it's kind of like a messy style.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of dissonance in it, so you can land on the wrong note, and you'd be like, no, it's kind of my intention. But then it comes to like blues and rock, and like people will always be saying things like, blues is Mixolydian, so you just play Mixolydian. Have you ever tried that? Like, I just found it doesn't work very well.
Yeah. I don't really like Mixolydian too much. I just don't like. Yeah,
like they're technically right. Here's
yeah.
A 13, but A7, right? Yeah, it's the right scale. But I always found thinking about it like that just makes it really, really hard to make all of that work.
Mm.
And I certainly couldn't. What I would end up playing is, I'm just blitzing a scale. And so when I hand you a jazz standard, it's like, well, I hear lots of notes when people play jazz, and I just do that kind of the same kind of thing. And what really works, I think, is one, the old rule of, you can play whatever you want as long as you hear it. Which is one of those things that guy tried to drive home to me, and I just kind of glossed on it. I think it's a 14-year-old. I had to learn all 7 modes overnight. So like I was like, we had 2 lessons back to back, and one was going to be on modes, the other was going to be on chords. So like, I was really studying up on just how to get the things under my fingers and know them well enough. But thinking about them as, say, like pentatonics or as arpeggios, it's really hard for me to determine the difference a lot of the time between when I'm thinking as a pentatonic or when I'm thinking as an arpeggio, and especially the blues sense. Like a there's a whole bunch of stuff in there, like chromatic things that are from chord tones to other chord tones. This my favorite A opening box. Yeah, it's really hard to define. Am I thinking of that as an A pentatonic, or maybe even box 3 on A?
Yeah.
Or am I thinking about that as arpeggio? Because that's an A6 arpeggio. And these days, it's very, very much one of those options, and it's mostly guided by ear. It's a killer lick. If you don't already know that, the 50s lick. Chuck Berry stole it from here. Yeah, you always split that major minor third. But I would also add the dominant on that, right? And then if you come down, right? Using a lot of the, you think about it as your blue note, you think about it as your minor third. And then suddenly I'm using the 6. Well, I quite like the 6 in this register, and if I'm going to use the 7, I think the 7 is a louder note. So combining all those ideas, and then also thinking with where I'm going next, my next chord. So like, sorry, this is a distraction, but we're talking blues now. A fun thing to do is if you just take like those 2 strings, like the 2 strings. Because like the major difference between those 2 chords is, that's your D7 and that's your A7.
Yeah.
So like, you can come up with a bunch of melodies where you kind of hover in this area, and as long as you're on the change of the D, you hit the flat 7 or you hit the third. You get a lot of interesting voice lick and a lot of interesting kind of lines. Anyway, that's blues. That's later on the sheet. Do you play a lot of blues?
Not very recently, no. I wanted to get into it because it does sound very cool. Like, it's either because the person I get my guitars off, he's a guitar maker, and he has a friend who does jazz lessons. So I was thinking of taking a few with him just as like an extra thing, sort of like maybe like just a few lessons to get something out of it, because it's always sounded like something I've wanted to do, but I sort of don't know where to like start with it, because there's so many things with chromaticism, like where to lead notes, and especially like relating to the chords. That's the thing I sort of find tricky. Yeah.
Look, the simplest answer with chromatic, there are a lot of rules, and I'm in your course somewhere you'll have a look at the bebop scale, and when you talk about the bebop scale, there'll be a whole bunch of rules. Your chromatic notes have got to be on this beat in the bar, and yada yada. It's kind of true. All of these guidelines with music are like kind of, what's the Pirates of the Caribbean line? Like they're all guidelines.
Yeah.
And rules. I would say any chromatic will work if you're going from chord tone to chord tone.
Yeah.
And a great place to kind of put that in might be, so your first 1 to 4 change. You got. So if you think of any notes from that, like A7. Right? that announced the chord change pretty damn well. So yeah, I was going from the 5th of A up to the 3rd of D.
Right.
Yeah. Alternatively, like we could go from the A root down to the F sharp here, right? So
Oh,
all the way down to this, we're going down to
yeah.
So like the chromatic thing is there's no real rule with it. The idea is that chromatic should be on the upbeat. A lot of the time, even that is, I think, too much to think about.
Yeah.
You know, you'll feel it as you play it. But if that's so jazz or blues, kind of both is a goal, or
Yeah, because I mean, I sort of started playing blues, but sort of went away from that, and then yeah, I don't really know which one because they both sound really interesting. So maybe a bit of both rather.
look, I think blues is a great gateway drug into jazz. Certainly, that's the path I took, and a lot of people took that. It's quite often when you play blues for a while and you're like, I want to do something a little bit more than this.
Yeah.
You know, it's really easy, and okay, it's unfair to pigeonhole blues this way, but it's really easy to get trapped in, you know, pentatonic riffs from the 70s with blues. And you kind of feel like, yeah, I can play Red House by Jimi Hendrix, so like it's all over, surely. Like that's all I need to do. So like you then get into like expensive blues, you know, blues that starts using more and more extensions. You might say do some more interesting things through the chord progression. I tell you what, if you scroll all the way down to the bottom of the sheet, this is kind of where we're getting to. So like, okay, step one, getting into blues. Most people take a 12 bar and they know their pentatonic scales. So you might, so I'll do the major. Right?
Yeah.
Standard kind of bluesy stuff. So the whole time there, I'm just using a box 2 pentatonic. I think you'd call it E shape.
Yeah, and I started sort of learning them as boxes. It was a bit tricky to sort of do it at first, but yeah, I think I just sort of at first I was remembering sort of box 1, then 1 back and forth, so 5 and 1. Oh, sorry, 5 and 2, and then sort of just filling in the gaps. Because yeah, I found it easier to call them as like the chord shape at first, but then yeah, it doesn't really work when you're trying to explain it or sort of use it in something that's outside of that sort of chord shape.
Yeah, the one thing that I always found difficult about that naming system, one, I never learned it in that naming system.
Yeah.
When I learned all this stuff was to call them boxes. Cage was a revolution that came out like after my time in some ways. However, I mean, I think the cage system is still good. The one problem I have is that I don't always associate the E box with E.
Yeah.
You know, like quite often with an E-shaped chord, I might associate what I would call box 3, which you'd call the D shape. Now, realistically, okay, it doesn't actually matter what we call these things.
Yeah.
Right? Like we're all talking the same language. We're talking the same notes on the fretboard, the same shape. So you could think about it in any of these terms, but I don't like that in implicit implication that there's some kind of link between them, other than that's the most basic way of viewing a chord relationship to that box.
Yeah.
You know, like there are definitely some cool things you can do. Like if you take an A major 7 and you play box 1 minor, but back a fret. Right, what you end up with is a
Yeah.
Which is great on the subdominant chord. So you get this kind of like clashy way of using a shape on the fretboard that you're familiar with from somewhere else in a different context, but to express something much more complicated.
Yeah.
A much more common one might be, let's say, on C major 7, you play E minor pentatonic. So that would mean that for C major 7, we're playing this guy, box 2, where you'd find that C major 7 voice. And for me, just calling them boxes means that I find that a lot easier to kind of work around.
Yeah.
I'm playing in a shape. Anyway, okay, so getting started with the blues. So box 2 pentatonic, E shape pentatonic on A.
And could I just ask a quick question about sort of the major and minor differences? When you're saying, say, box 1 major, is that just you'd be starting from, say, A, you'd be starting from A, but a box 1 minor, you'd be starting from A, but then box 1 major, you'd be starting from the C? Or would you call that box 2?
Usually when I'm teaching, I keep all of the numbers the same. So I would normally call box 2 box 2. But a lot of people do think about it. If I'm in major, then box 2 would become 1.
Yeah, that's the thing I think I found tricky at the first, because you sort of shift everything back or shift everything sort of forward. No, actually back. So box 2 becomes 1.
Frets, but we've got to walk before we can run. But if we think about, if we take an A blues, right, we could play A pentatonic, A major pentatonic. That sounds cool, right? Okay, but we could also play box 1 in minor, because blues has these funny rules about splitting, right? Where they use the major and minor third together all the time. So you get a sharper sound. Still works, but what we're actually doing there is kind of changing the chord. We're adding a sharp 9 and a dominant 7th instead of what we're doing. We're just having the 6. So you can do a lot of lines where you split the difference and play both boxes. Right, where you're just kind of constantly going backwards and forwards between major and minor.
Yeah.
There are also a bunch of rules that help with that. Quite often people will use minor on the 4 chord and use the major box on the 1 chord. Again, walk before you can run. We can just start with the plain major box. Yeah, I mean, actually, if you think of the intro solo to Johnny B. Good, right? The majority of that time. Right, that's a one that's constantly splitting. He starts to all of that could be considered box 1 in minor, but then he gets up to that and that's major. Right? If you listen to Clapton playing pretty much anything, but especially his live versions of Have You Ever Loved a Woman, he's constantly going backwards and forwards between major and minor. It is a really cool thing to play around with. And also, you know, in rock solos, in rock solos where they're in major. Right, so you get major. That's now minor. And you come back into major. A good example of that would be something like the Crossroads 2004 Gravity solo by John Mayer at the end. He's constantly, I think, going between. See if I can remember. I think G major and G minor. so E minor and G minor. And it can be a really powerful sound. Quite often, like, if you've been doing the major thing for a while and you go to minor, it suddenly spices it into something. Okay,
Yeah.
getting started with blues. What we got? So like a 15-minute thing. Do it. Box 2 pentatonic. With your blue note, so good idea to know where your blue notes are.
Yeah. Wait.
So, okay, then down 1 octave. This is your first bit of chromatic you can throw in, right? Like,
Yeah.
Okay, so really to get going with blues, first step I would say is learn your chord progression 1, 4, and 5. You need to memorize that sound to the point where you can kind of play the track in your head, right? A lot of people will still use backing tracks and still use, like your loopers and things. That's fine, but don't rely on them. Like one of the things I hopefully have driven home across this year is like, you need that track playing in your head. You need to find the right tones at the right time.
Yeah.
Ignoring all of that for a second, if we just think of the pentatonic and the blues scale, we can pretty much play whatever we want. Let me just do a quick. Oh, damn it. That's pressing record. No. Okay, so. Okay, so realistically, we can play pretty much whatever we want inside the scale. Let's get some cool. And you should definitely start there. Some things to bear in mind, some things that make you sound much better than other beginners in this style is if you say something, say it twice, think about call and response, think about melodic mirroring, right?
Yeah.
Blues solos can be one note. Like we could just constantly hit the room.
Yeah.
Rhythm, right? So that's a cool place to start. And then I would say, okay, we've got one note. When I get bored of that one note, let's add one of the other notes next to it in the scale. So a lot of repetition, a lot of playing with the shape of a melody. which is a great place to start improvisationally because it's one of those things that we tend to lose track of, especially when people throw modes at you and a whole bunch of options.
Yeah.
Your first instinct is to play all of these options. And really what we need to do is listen to these options. So the cool thing about starting this way with the blues is there's kind of no wrong answer. You can pretty much choose any one of these notes against any one of these chords and you will get a cool sound. Some of them will be quite tense, but blues is at times. This dissonant thing is one of these things that you're allowed to do in blues and allowed to do in jazz. Jazz's dissonance has a lot more rules to it, in the sense that if you sit on some of the notes in jazz and you just keep playing that one note, it's going to just sound like you're out. So a lot of people learn licks, that's cool. That can give you some ideas in the scale. There's going to be hundreds of lick videos online. But I don't even really necessarily think you need to. You should start, I think, by listening and playing with the scale by listening to it. And, you can get some cool stuff. Like, I think some of that stuff where I was even just playing two notes still sounds pretty cool.
Yeah.
It's not like that's an awful sound. And beginning to improvise in a style is always about, did it sound like some music?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's just using box 2 pentatonic. Playing around with that blue note is going to be quite cool too. Like,
and is the blue note just the minor third, just repeated throughout?
Yeah. So minor third from the major perspective, flat 5 from the minor perspective.
Yeah.
Right. So the next step on top of that, after you've played around with that a little bit, might be to start thinking about moving with the chords or changing your scale occasionally. Right. So a good option, like we discussed earlier, might be you go to box minor, the minor pentatonic. When you hit the 4 chords, so you get. Right, so I'll play with the back track. Oh, I just missed the 4 chord. Come on. So that's a good rule a lot of people follow, is when we hit subdominant, we switch to minor. The questions start appearing of like, why? Why does minor pentatonic work well against the subdominant? The answer is always look at your chord, right, and look at the scale, and think what extensions and notes that scale is becoming when I play that chord. So on a D7 chord, the notes of A minor pentatonic is the dominant 7th, 8, right? We're hitting the 7. 7s and 3s are going to become really important in jazz blues. The 4, that's quite a spicy note, right? So that's going to be one of those ones where we probably want to bend it. It's going to sound quite expensive against that. Then we get the 9, that's a cool choice. The root, the 7, right? Going back down, 5th, 4. So what we're really doing is kind of doing a D9, a D11 sound on top of that D.
Yeah.
Which is why it's going to suddenly click and sound cool. From there, you might say, well, okay, what if box 2 works against the 1 chord? What if I played all of those, the equivalent major pentatonic against all of these? So I could do major pentatonic on 1, major pentatonic on 4, and then the 5 chord.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. And quite interesting is you'll probably like it kind of up until the 5 chord.
Yeah.
Pentatonics are not great at expressing dominant sounds.
Yeah.
Which is hilarious when you think that it's like it's the backbone of blues playing. You know, without altering the pentatonic, we don't really say dominant. You know, we're saying 6/9 all the time. And on that 5 chord, it would be really nice to have that dominant sound. So after you've experimented with your pentatonics, I reckon step back a step and come back to arpeggios. And you think of, say, A7 as arpeggio, D7, and E7. And with that, you could just overlay box 2 even.
Yeah.
And overlay those notes on top and use them as your guide tones to come up with your solo ideas. I'm going to start doing a jazz blues now, where I start doing different turns. So there's like months and months and months, a good couple of years of things you can play around with inside of just those ideas.
Yeah.
Different keys, different styles too. Like, you know, blues is a pretty wide genre. Minor blues is really lovely, but with minor blues, you don't get this kind of splitting option. You can't use major and minor in a minor. You can only really use minor.
Yeah.
So listening to start with, take your pentatonic scales, and then to make yourself sound more tied into chords, come back to your arpeggios and use those as your guide tones and your ideas on how to approach. So I would, I'd take a lick like this, or transpose that across your chords. So.
And are you you're just changing the box depending on the chord, or?
Well, in that instance, what I was doing is thinking purely arpeggio, right?
Yeah.
Minor third, major third, then 5, kind of 6 or 7, up to the roof, right? So when I switch over to the D chord, I've got to go minor. Here's D. The minor third, major third, 5, 6, 7.
Yeah.
You know, there are a whole bunch of things in there which are really good to experiment with. You'll notice that 6th sound, the third to the root, that's a really common resolve in blues. And it's usually quite a great way of resolving a line. You can kind of go off on a wander and then come back.
Yeah.
So have a stab. Try to throw some of those ideas together. I'd play your chords, but I'm going to be super delayed.
Yeah, and I'll try to get a recording of me doing a bit of it, and then I'll send it to you over the week.
Yeah, that's okay.
And then, because I don't have a loop pedal, I need to get a loop pedal, but I can probably just stitch the two together, just play over it.
And like you don't have to worry about the full 12-bar form. You could just worry to begin with just the 1 to 4 change.
Yeah.
Right? And the way I think about it when I play a blues is it's like you're on a chord for a while and you feel the tension raised, and then you hit a new chord, and then you sit there for a while, then you feel the tension raised, then you do like, and it's always this kind of like, here's the chord, raise the tension, new chord, raise the tension, new chord, raise the tension up to the 5, and the 5 is the peak, and then it falls from.
Yeah.
And to me, that kind of helps the way I feel my solo, right? Like, I'll do something super basic. We're on the 1 chord, right? So I don't know if you could feel what I'm talking about. It's like I'm sitting here on the one, nice and bland ideas. The one's coming to an end. Okay, I've got to do something spicy to kind of push myself to that thing.
So it's sort of like transitioning to the chord before the chord started.
Yeah,
Sort
it's
of.
a bit like a secondary dominant idea. It's like I'm not transitioning to the chord yet, but I am going to include some ideas that's going to go, oh, this is spicy and new. Here's the new chord. I'm announcing that chord before I get there.
Yeah.
Now that idea of feeling the tension is really key in improvisation.
Yeah.
And you start pushing that idea further and further. So what I was doing then was just using the 7, right? Doing A, and then I go A7 to my D, right? Then I might go D7 to get me back to the key. Eventually, all the other things, if you listen to enough of it, you'll pick up some things like here's A. Oh, here's this D sharp 9, right? Something totally chromatic in sense. Like the justification there is it's fret higher than the chord I'm going to, so it's going to work.
Yeah.
So you might try to include that in your solo. Something totally outside. Right, like. Right, and that's when you start getting into these kind of more jazzy sounds. Another option might be that on the way to the 4 chord, right, we know we're heading here, so we can do a 2-5 chant. Right, so that's when you start getting things that sound much classier, much more in the direction of jazz. And it kind of does outline the basics you need for jazz by doing that, right?
Yeah, because I think especially when I tried to play a lot with modes before, I learned sort of when I was learning, sort of I learned the pentatonics and the modes at sort of at the same time, but never sort of really got the full application of them. I learned the shapes. Obviously, I learned the modes a bit clearer because I knew obviously what degree they all fell on, but I never sort of understood the implications of the pentatonic. And then I sort of got I didn't really think about what notes I was playing. I just sort of played obviously the boxes over the chord progression, but I never thought about sort of the leading notes into the next chords and sort of thinking about it with the chord tones and stuff like that. But yeah, it makes a lot more sense now.
Yeah, so really what you got to do is just dive in, right? Like give yourself if you don't want to record anything, there are tons of backing tracks. One problem with the backing tracks is finding one that you really like the feel of.
Yeah.
That can be really difficult. And sometimes, like as a beginner, sometimes you fire up a backing track, well, it's playing a blues and I can't play over this. And it's like, actually, you can't play over this because you just can't get into it.
Yeah.
So I'd either record some chords for yourself, but then just start playing real basic, just play with pentatonic. Just play with pentatonic and blues, and then try to do that all over the neck.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it does not have to be flashy. In some ways, listening to a bunch of the blues heroes is going to be disadvantageous. You know, I wish I'd started by listening to like more popular stuff from the 40s instead of like jumping straight in at blues heroes. Because the blues hero guys, they use their pentatonic boxes with a lot of influence from that stuff, but it's they sound more like licks.
Yeah.
Whereas some of the piano players, they really, you can really hear. Oh, actually, no, that's how they're structuring this solo. You can hear how they're transitioning from chord to chord. And I wish I'd learned that first, because realistically, the lick stuff is easy, verbatim. You study it and you practice it 4 million times, and then you can start playing these things. Whereas what you need to focus on is the sound of the chords, and how do I make this sound like that chord? How do I make the music direct me to this chord?
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna have to pack up because we're a little over time.
Yeah, that was all good.
Yeah. So really knock together recording. Where if you want, we could meet up in between, have a little chat. Let me know how you go with it.
Yeah.
All right, man. Good to see you.
Yeah, you too. Yeah. I'll see you next time.
Yeah, catch you at the next one.